This is a Canadian $5 bill. It has no relevance to this video, so let's get this out of the way. Well, we'll leave it there because I gotta cover up some stuff. Anyways, once upon a time, many moons ago, I came across a Game Boy Advance cart containing 3 classic Atari games: Pong, Asteroids, and Yours Revenge. I did a video on this many moons ago. Sometime later, I came across another Game Boy Advance cartridge, also containing another 3 classic Atari games: Millipede, Super Breakout, and Lunar Lander. Again, did a video on this many moons ago. And what these 2 games have in common, aside from the fact that they each have 3 games, and they're all Atari games, is that one of the games on each cart, Pong in this case, Super Breakout in the other, originally used a device we like to call the paddle controller, or there's basically a little knob that you twist back and forth for somewhat precise analog control, so you can move their paddle as slow or as quickly as you need to, depending on the situation. Naturally, this being on the Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Advance comes with a built-in D-pad, like so. And the D-pad, to put it bluntly, is not the best replacement for the paddle controller, since the D-pad is more of a digital input, whereas the paddle is a analog thing. In any event, the best I would say is, if you couldn't get used to the digital controls of Pong or Super Breakout, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. I think I've said as much in prior videos. So, I recently came across another Game Boy Advance compilation of 3 classic Atari games. And this one is the opposite of this. This one contains Centipede, Breakout, and Warlords. I say this is the opposite of the other ones because, as you could probably guess, if you know your Atari games that is, there are 2 games on this cart that originally used a paddle controller.
Let's start with Centipede, the classic shooter where you control a magic wand charged with the goal of clearing away mushrooms to kill the eponymous centipede, all the while fending off spiders, scorpions, and those things that fall from the sky. Unlike the other 2 games in this compilation, Centipede originally used a trackball controller, and while a D-pad isn't a perfect substitute, I could say that control of this version of Centipede is solid, and the gameplay is true to any other competent version of Centipede. The game feels a bit slower, and despite the inclusion of difficulty settings, the speed of the game never really changes to the point where it becomes remotely a challenge. It's more of an endurance than anything. There's also the case of the screen being more widescreen than normal due to the resolution of the screen. Centipede was originally a vertically oriented thing, but you could change this to a small option which reduces the size of the playfield to sort of replicate that vertical orientation thing. Or you could tilt the screen to its side, and that feels awkward. There's also a number of backgrounds you could choose from if the standard black display is too bland for you. I personally found some of these backgrounds distracting and pointless, though I like the reflective display setting. That's alright, I guess. Next up, we have Breakout, the classic brick-breaking game that you normally play with a paddle controller for proper precision, but because this is a Game Boy Advance, you're stuck with the D-pad, and I'm sorry to say that control is what ruins this version of Breakout, which is actually based on the Atari 2600 version of the game. Simply put, your paddle moves way too fast, forcing you to have to tap the D-pad in order to make more precise movements, and even this method feels somewhat cumbersome. Now, Breakout does provide you with variations of play that you could implement. Timed games, breakthrough games, catch variations, among others, and these can be combined in various forms if desired, but none of these modes will provide you with the means to better control your paddle. This befuddles me. I get that these compilations were put out on the cheap, most of these I got from the dollar store of all places, but if you were going to include paddle-based games, you could have done something to give the player a little more control over your paddle. A digital pad may be a shit replacement for a paddle controller, but you, in theory, could have used the buttons to control the speed of the paddle somewhat. Nintendo figured this out with Alleyway, a 1990 Game Boy release, and that worked fine. Not great, but fine. Even the Game Boy Color version of Super Breakout, which I looked at earlier, had a button that you could speed the paddle up if you held it down. It wasn't great, but it was workable somewhat. But here, not a bloody thing done. You press left to move left, you press right to move right, and the buttons do absolutely fuck all. They don't slow down the paddle, they don't speed up the paddle. It's absolutely ridiculous. And finally we have Warlords, another paddle game. In this one you fend off against 3 other Warlords, deflecting a fireball and trying to break down their defensive walls. Warlords has a cool bit where if you hold down the button you can catch the fireball and launch it elsewhere, though this chips your barrier away bit by bit. It's a fun but challenging little game unless you know what you're doing, and there's a multiplayer option that allows you to compete against 3 other players, presumably with some sort of game link apparatus, which is rather nice, and I kinda wish they added something like this to their Pong game on one of their other compilations. But on the other hand, I kinda wish there was also a means of better controlling your paddle, because much like in Breakout, the paddle moves about quite slippery and quite quickly, making it somewhat difficult to manage. Although it's less of a problem here than it is in Breakout. That's very faint praise, by the way. Let's get some general bits out of the way. With the exception of Warlords, which is a nice, colorful game that resembles the arcade game it's based on both in terms of visuals and some sound quality, you're given a variety of display options that allows you to change the background art, the color of said art or lack thereof, as well as the visual orientation. Keep it the default widescreen, add a border to reduce the resolution and the playfield somewhat, or tilt the screen to its side to replicate the original vertical orientation of the arcade games in exchange for some awkward handling of your Game Boy Advance. I never got the point of this, so I never used it. In regards to the actual visuals and sound quality, it varies of course, but generally quality is good as each of the 3 games resemble their original counterparts quite nicely. All the bits from Centipede look and sound like what they're supposed to. Breakout is given a decent replication, for lack of a better term, and like I said before, Warlords looks the part. For all the faults and quibbles there is to be had with DSi's games' various GBA compilations, the one thing I could never knock is the audio-visual presentation. They've done as good a job as possible to retain that aspect of this port. Ultimately, of the various DSi games compilations I've played up to this point, this is perhaps the weakest of the bunch. Centipede plays rather nicely all things considered, but it's probably the only one that does in this compilation because the D-pad is a somewhat adequate replacement for the trackball, and while you have numerous versions of Centipede on consoles with joystick or digital gamepads that play rather nicely. Breakout and Warlords are somewhat playable if you could put up with the slippery paddle speed, but otherwise it's just irritating tripe. Overall, if you want a decent version of Centipede for Game Boy Advance on the cheap, this is probably a good way to go for, but otherwise, not worth breaking a leg over. There are better versions of Centipede out there, there are better versions of Breakout out there, you could probably find a better version of Warlords out there if you look hard enough. If you go through life never coming across this compilation or never even playing it for that matter, let's just say you won't be missing much.